Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers, is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book, a program of the Minnesota Humanities Commission, with funding provided by Target Stores and the Elmer L. and Eleanor J. Anderson Foundation.
Welcome to Northern Lights. I'm Becky Norlien. We're here in the North Shore of Lake Superior, just above Two Harbors, Minnesota, and we're talking with Charles Baxter today. Hello. Thank you for inviting us to your cabin here on the North Shore.
My pleasure.
Charles Baxter is an author with Minnesota connections. He grew up in the Twin Cities area and graduated from Macalester College. He now lives in Ann Arbor and comes back to Minnesota for vacations and now spends considerable time writing here. Charles Baxter has written poetry, short stories, and also novels. And his latest book is Feast of Love, which came out in late April of 2000. How has it been for getting this one launched?
It's been exciting. It hasn't been like any of my other books, really. For one thing, the print run of this book is much, much larger. The first printing of it was 30,000 copies in comparison to my last book, Believers, which was, I think, around 10. And this one also has had a movie sale. So there's been a fair amount of excitement isn't quite the word, but developments as far as sales are concerned, reviews are concerned. It's been quite a ride.
How is it different working with a publisher when it's a more well-known, now that you're more established and you're working with a larger outfit, I suppose when you started with New Rivers Press, and how does the process differ?
It's the profit motive. The difference is that when you have a large publisher like Pantheon, they're very, very eager to make money. And it's not that New Rivers Press isn't, but it's, when you read about them, when you open one of their books, you discover that the phrase is that it is a non-profit press, and that means that they do a wonderful job of discovering new writers and getting the books out onto the shelves. But they don't have much money to advertise, and they don't have very much money for publicity or sending an author out on an author tour, and that's what a publisher like Pantheon or Norton or Viking, it's what they all have, and so it's very, very different. You lose and you gain. You lose a little bit of your privacy when your work goes public like this, but you gain, I suppose, in a certain amount of reader recognition too.
How have you had good experiences with the editors you've worked with?
Well, I've had wonderful experiences. You know that what people often say now is that editors don't edit anymore. What they do is to acquire books, and they work with the marketing and distribution departments of the house in order to figure out ways to best merchandise a book. But the editing, somebody else does that. In my case, I've been very lucky because I have two editors. There were two editors for this book, for The Feast of Love, and two editors for Believers, and they both take great, great care with the actual editing, with the sentences. And although they don't edit my work heavily, they're very careful about what goes into the book, and they worry a great deal about tone and pace and the shape of the manuscript. So I've been very lucky.
Could you talk some about the process of moving from writing poetry to writing stories?
Sure. I think a great many writers go through the same process that I've been through. I know that on this program that Jonas Agee was interviewed some time ago, and Jonas also began more or less as a lyric poet and gradually moved into the writing of fiction. In my own case, when I started writing, I was more interested in purely lyric statement, the kind of thing that fits or is part of the writing of poetry. And gradually what I discovered was that my work, such as it was going in a narrative direction. I was writing poems that told stories, that created characters, that evoked settings. And I would write these poems and people would say to me, "You're telling stories in these poems. Why don't you write prose?" And slowly but surely, gradually, I found that, in fact, the kind of work I was doing would probably be more effective as prose. So I spent several years learning the craft of fiction. I wrote 3 novels that were never published, mostly because they were very bad. And then I thought, well, maybe my gifts, if indeed I have any, would be better suited to the short story form instead of the novel. And the short story form accommodates lyric writing, like poetry, although I have to say I don't like poetic prose all that much. But I found that I was more comfortable writing fiction. I liked characters, I liked settings, I liked stories. And the older you get, the more comfortable you are with that kind of writing, or at least I was. So that's pretty much all I do now. I don't write poetry very much anymore.
Do you write poetry for your own use, as expression sometimes?
Yeah, it's interesting you should ask that question, because in fact I do. I write poems for myself or for the desk drawer, or when somebody has a birthday or an anniversary, or there's some occasion, I will write a poem, or when it suits me, but I don't publish poetry anymore. I'm out of that. I'm happy to be out of that.
Well, let's pause at this point and hear a bit from one of your stories.
Well, I should set this up a little bit. I'm going to read you a paragraph from a story called Snow. And the situation in this story is that a car has gone through the ice on a Minnesota lake, and 2 young men, 2 brothers, actually they're still in junior high, go out to look at it. The ice has reformed over the hole that the car has made, and the younger brother is narrating the story. This new ice was so smooth that it reminded me of the thick glass in the Shedd Aquarium in Chicago. But instead of seeing a loggerhead turtle or a barracuda, I looked through the ice and saw this abandoned car, this 2-door Impala. It was wonderful to see, white-painted steel filtered by ice and lake water, and I wanted to laugh out of sheer happiness at the craziness of it. Dimly lit but still visible through the murk, it sat down there, its huge trunk and the sloping fins just a bit green in the algae-colored light. This is a joke, I thought, a practical joke meant to confuse the fish. I could see the car well enough to notice its radio antenna and the windshield wipers halfway up the front window, and I could see the chrome of the front grille reflecting the dull light that ebbed down to it from where we were lying on our stomachs, 10 feet above it.
Now that's something you really saw as a young person, isn't it?
Something I really saw on Lake Minnetonka west of Minneapolis. Yes, my brother had come into my room and said, listen, we've got to go down to Lake Minnetonka. There's this car that's gone through the ice at a pressure ridge, and they're going to pull it out. They're going to bring a tow truck out onto the ice, and they're going to be, I don't know how he ever found these things out. He was always finding things out before I was. He said they're going to get 2 scuba divers with wetsuits to attach a chain to it, and they're going to pull it up. We've got to see it. So he took me out, and the ice was perfectly clear, and we looked down, and we saw this car underneath, must have been a foot of ice down there at the bottom of the lake, and I thought, what a wonderful sight. I thought it was great. And so, yes, it's something I actually saw.
Does that happen a lot, where memories and real images and experiences are woven into your fiction?
They do. It gets all mixed together. I make up things and I paste them onto things that I remember. Fiction writers are great daydreamers. I'm a great daydreamer. I always was a daydreamer. When I was in elementary school, I sat in the back row looking out the window. And I think the process of writing fiction often involves putting together things that you remember with things that you've made up. I don't put real people, for the most part, into my stories, because I think that's not fair to them. I think ethically it's a very odd and probably creepy thing to do, to put real people into stories, although I have occasionally done it. But
well, now, at Feast of Love, which I am still looking forward to reading, but I've learned that it has a character named Charlie Baxter.
Funny you should say that. Yeah, there is a character named Charlie Baxter, which happens to be my name, and he lives in Ann Arbor, where I live, and he lives on Woodland Drive, which happens to be my street. And he appears at the beginning and the end of the novel as a kind of story collector. He suffers from insomnia, as I do. And at the beginning of the Feast of Love, he wakes up, or he's awake in the middle of the night. He can't get back to sleep. And he walks down his street to a park where he runs into somebody he knows who's also awake in the middle of the night, and his friend says, "You're having a writing block, I bet." And Charlie says, "Yes." And this guy says, "Well, why don't you let me tell you my story? And I'll send you other people I know, and they can tell you their stories too. And you just put it into your book, and that'll be the end of your writing block." So that's the frame of the book. And people have asked me, is that really you at the beginning of the book? This guy who has your name? And I've said, well, yes and no. But really the truth is that it isn't, because I never take walks at night. I would never think of walking to a park in the middle of the night. And I don't know anybody named Bradley Smith, so you know, I've used a little bit of myself, but mostly it's all imaginary. Fiction writers are great liars.
And you're allowed to be.
Yeah. That's our business. We're supposed to make things up.
Well, let's pause again and let you read a bit from Feast of Love.
Okay, this is Bradley, the guy that Charlie has met in the park, and he has decided to drive north to get his dog back, but he runs a coffee shop named Jitters, and he's had a bit too much coffee, so he's over-caffeinated. The trouble was that I had lingered over a bit too much caffeine myself, with the result that my nerves were on fire, and I was pulled over and ticketed on I-75 just north of Bay City for driving 85 miles an hour. The patrolman was a squat, bullet-headed youth with a mean and forthright expression of contempt. When I pulled out my wallet from my sport coat, several nuggets of dog kibble cascaded out. The cop, seeing this, intensified his expression of scorn His face looked as if it had been made out of concrete. "Officer, everyone was driving that speed," I said, sounding authoritative, like a war correspondent. "We all were. I don't see why you singled me out." "Sir," he said, even his voice sounded concrete-like, "let me ask you a question. Have you ever gone hunting? Up north?" "Hunting? Once or twice. But I don't see what... Duck hunting?" "No. Well, maybe once." "Well," he said, "if you'd ever gone duck hunting and you were there in the marshes, let's say in the early morning, you know, at first light, when you aimed your gun, would you shoot at the individual duck or would you shoot at the whole flock? You'd aim at one of them, wouldn't you? Well, that's what I did. I aimed at you, and it seemed I landed you." So he opened his book and wrote out the ticket. But I explained to him, as he wrote, that I had been in a hurry to get a dog, my dog, and I explained about my wife leaving me. But he seemed quite unsympathetic and unmoved, and certainly not about to eat the ticket on my behalf. He was a callow youth with a simple idea of law-breaking and had suffered no setbacks in the wars of love. So that's Bradley on his way up to get his dog back, and I can assure you that he does get the dog back, though it's not an easy process. And he does get a second ticket before it's all over. He's one of those persons who doesn't really learn from his mistakes. That's one of his unfortunate features. He's a very lovable guy, but he doesn't really learn.
Your books seem to have a lot of ordinary things happening. And one of the things that's nice about reading one of your stories is that it doesn't take, you know, the coincidence of the long-lost cousin or, you know, something else implausible to make something wonderful happen. It just takes what's inside of ordinary moments. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Oh, I'd love to, and I'm so glad you asked me about that, because I think it's really not up my alley to write about extraordinary people with incredible amounts of money who are going around kidnapping national secrets, killing people, and having, you know, these sort of Hollywood adventures. I really think that for myself, the business of writing involves writing about people that almost any reader, I hope, would recognize. You might like my characters, you might be irritated by them, you might, I don't know, fall in love with them, but whatever your reaction would be, I would hope that you would find them recognizable, the sorts of people that you know. And I think that some of the hardest kinds of fiction to write are those in which ordinary life is made extraordinary again, worth our attention, worth reading about. It is what I think great literature often does, is to find the sorts of people you thought weren't worth reading about. And then you discover that, in fact, their lives are as full of drama, as full of poetry, as full of passion and interest as anybody else's life. I think the great problem with certain kinds of movies and certain kinds of TV dramas is that they convince people that the only stories that are worth our attention are stories in which there is violence or almost unimaginable high drama. But that's not really, I think, what the kind of art that I care about does. What I do, and what the writers whose work I care about tend to do, is to write about recognizable people. People whose lives are, as you say, ordinary. I don't think any life is truly ordinary.
Mm-hmm.
If you scratch hard enough, you're going to find something that's extraordinary in it.
And everything that happens has many layers of complexity behind it.
Exactly, exactly. My friends, my relatives, people I've met, all have immensely interesting lives. And you only have to spend a little time talking to them to find out how complex and interesting their lives really are.
Mm-hmm. Some of your work has themes about, people finding what's right or confronting evil in various forms. Do you think of yourself as a spiritual writer?
Well, I do and I don't. It's not as if I feel as if I'm getting up and giving sermons to anybody. So that part of the spiritual life I'm not really interested in doing. But I think, to go back to our other question, if you're going to write about ordinary people, that part of that maybe involves or should involve the inner life that anyone lives. And in my writing, it often means writing about what people believe in, what they have to believe in just in order to get out of bed in the morning. And the larger things that they believe in, what sort of meaning they give to their lives, and what sort of presences they feel are there. And if you write about those things, I think you're writing about the spirit to one degree or another. You're writing about the matters of what used to be called soul making. And to that degree, I think, I'd say, sure, I write about spiritual matters. I'm not uncomfortable with that idea.
How does writing here in this setting, does that affect your sense of having spirit and bringing spirit into your writing?
Well, it does in a number of ways. For one thing, if you're just looking out the window at some of this, the sense of the vastness of things, which often we don't feel in the Midwest. You think of the small spaces that you have to make do with. It's not true here. You really have a sense of the power and the force of nature, often very dangerous. The extremes of weather we have here, various kinds of extremes. You develop a real respect for all of that. And also, I think people who live up here for any extended amount of time, my case anyway, is that you become conscious also not of the noise of the cities, the phones and the internet and the traffic. You become quite aware of silence. If I were to stop talking, we would hear the wind and the sound of the waves on the rocks. And it's good for a writer, I think, to have that in the background, because it helps, I don't know quite how to say this, it helps the voices in your head come to the surface. Any writer has to hear voices. If you don't hear the voices, you don't have the stories. You don't have the dialogue, you don't have the characters. And sometimes it's easier to come up with those voices if there isn't a lot of noise in the background, just the sound of waves on the rocks. I have written the greater part of the last 2 books up here, in this room, actually.
How does your teaching and your writing interplay with each other? Do they influence each other?
I used to be able to write at the same time that I was teaching. Now I can't do both. It takes too much energy to teach. In my own teaching, I found that it's very useful to writers to study other writers' writing very closely, not to interpret it, not for its symbolic or thematic material, but just to see how it was put together, to ask, how did Chekhov or Tolstoy or whoever it was, how did they do this? What could I learn from them? And I like teaching young writers, trying to help them get on the path to a life as an author. It's very difficult, but it's a wonderful thing to be able to do.
Very good. Do you have plans for what comes next? Are you already working on something?
Well, over on the other side of the room, there's a little laptop, and I'm working on a new book. I'm sort of fighting my way through a new writer's block, but I think that I have two characters from some of my previous stories. I know I have two characters from some of my previous stories, and I'm trying to put together a novel in which these earlier stories serve as the first three chapters, and then I'll expand from that into a full-length book about them.
Okay, you started by condensing some novels into short stories, and now you're going the opposite direction.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Full circle.
That's right.
Yes.
Well, wish me luck. Every time I start a new book, I feel as if I need it. You know, I think I don't have another book in me, and then it turns out that I do.
Well, we do wish you luck, because we'd very much like to have another book from you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you for hosting us here today, and thank everyone for joining us for Northern Lights. Thank you.
When I reached our front lawn, I stood out in the dark and looked in through the kitchen window. My mother and stepfather were sitting at the kitchen counter. I couldn't be sure if they were speaking to each other, but then I saw my mother raise her arm in one of her "can you believe this" gestures. I didn't want to go inside. I wanted to feel cold, so cold that the cold itself became permanently interesting. I took off my overcoat and my gloves. Tilting my head back, I felt some snow fall onto my face, and I bent down and stuck my hand into the snow and the frozen grass and held it there. The cold rose from my hand to my elbow, and when I had counted to 40 and couldn't stand another second of it, I picked up my coat and gloves and walked into the bright heat of the front hallway of my home.
Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers, is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book, a program of the Minnesota Humanities Commission, with funding provided by Target Stores and the Elmer L. and Eleanor J. Anderson Foundation.